Our text this morning comes from two sources, Luke and John. Luke chapter 24, beginning with verse 36. While they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. And he said to them, "Why are you frightened, and why do you doubt arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I. Touch me and see. For a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy they were disbelieving and still wondering. And he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it, and he ate in their presence. And now for John. "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. You heard me say to you, I am going away, and I am coming to you. If you love me, you would rejoice that I am going to the Father, because the Father is greater than I." The word of God for you, the people of God. Amen. After a few years of marriage, filled with constant arguments and agitations, a young man and his wife decided the only way to save their marriage was to try marital counseling. It was near the last straw. So they go to the counselor, and the counselor says and asks, what seems to be the problem? And the wife decides that she will take the time first to tell the problems. And after about 15 or 20 minutes, the counselor got up, walked over to the woman, took her by the elbow, stood her straight up, and then kissed her passionately right on the lips. And then sat her back down, walked back over, sat down behind the desk, and looked at the husband and said, "Your wife needs that twice a week." And the husband, kind of undone, says, "Sure, I can have her here on Tuesdays and Thursdays." One of my mother's warnings to me was when she had had enough, and it usually came through gritting teeth. "You are getting on my last nerve." And all that duck and cover I learned at school was also appropriate at home. When those remarks were made, I ducked and I covered. Lost nerves and lost straws can't be cured with aspirin or Tums. Sometimes lost nerves and last straws are too terrible. You know, there's those things that are mostly just aggravations. They may even be inconvenient. But when nerves and straws are emotional, when nerves and straws are relational, when they are emotional, psychological, they can be devastating, but not as tumultuous and devastating as when the last string and the last straw is spiritual. And there's nothing funny about last strings and last straws when it's spiritual. The Italian violinist Nicola Paganini was arguably at that time the best violinist in the world. People came from everywhere in Europe to hear him play. And there was always a filled auditorium. It sold out wherever he went. Well, there was a group of other violinists who wanted to honor him, and so they got him to come and play for the other respected violinists in Europe. The place was packed. And Paganini comes in and he stands center stage. He pulls out his violin with a giant smile on his face and he begins to play. And the violinists just swoon at the sound of his music. And in just a few minutes, a string popped on the violin and it hung ugly to the side. But he kept playing on. And then another string broke on the other side of the violin. But Nicola just kept playing on. And then the third string broke on the violin. But he continued to play. And he played for the rest of the concert. And afterwards, another violinist asked him, "Nicola, why did you play with just one string?" And Nicola said, "Because I had one string left to play on." Ever been there? Have you ever been there? One string breaks, then another, and all you have left is one string. Did you play on? Did you play on? Or did you just lie down, put the violin on the floor, and walk away? Adolf Hitler called it the Jewish problem. The problem? Jews were alive, and he wanted them dead. And one of the Jews that he wanted dead was Dr. Bernard Goldstein. And Goldstein told how his family was arrested one day, and he was taken to the Gestapo headquarters while his family was taken to the city jail. When he was led into the Gestapo headquarters, he was stripped naked. And they laughed at him. They poked fun at him. They sneered at him. And he was given very little water, and he was given very little food. And over the days, he barely had enough strength just to stand. Then one morning, the leader of the Gestapo group came into the room and stood in front of him, almost touched his nose with his nose, and said, "Dr. Goldstein, your family is dead. We have executed your wife and your children this morning. What do you have to say?" And Goldstein said he stood there and his knees buckled. He almost fell at his own feet. And he said his mind was twisted and jumbled with emotion, mixed with rage, as you can imagine, and grief, sadness, and anger. The crowd continued to laugh at the news, and they even seemed to celebrate it, said Dr. Goldstein. And he took a deep breath. He took a deep breath, and he made a long breath and began to speak in a thick, rhythmic tone these words: "You have taken away from me my life. You have taken my wife and my dear children. However, there is one thing you cannot steal. You cannot seize it with your control. You cannot destroy it with all your power. That precious gift is my self-respect. You will never have it." So stunned were those Gestapo agents that they handed him back immediately his clothes, and he began to dress himself. And as he dressed himself, the Gestapo agents left the room and left the door open. They left the building completely and left the outdoor open as well. Dr. Goldstein, because he would not let his self-respect be stolen, survived Auschwitz. You ever been there? Then there was a young man who was a POW in Vietnam, and he was told if he did exactly as instructed, the day would come when he would be led out into the jungle and set free. So after a few weeks and months, he became a model prisoner. And there were a couple other model prisoners as well. And they got to know each other. And he said that sometimes he would actually take part in the interrogations. He would take part in the disciplining of other troops. And then one day, he went to the latrine and he saw something. He looked behind the latrine, and there was a body back there. And it was the body of another model prisoner. And the hands were tied behind his back, and the feet were tied together. And there was a single bullet hole in the back of his head. He had been executed. And this model prisoner, as told by another model prisoner, went back to his hooch, took all of his clothes and put it beside his mat, and laid down on the mat and never drank or ate anything after that, and died. It was his last straw. The last string had broken for him. Now, in our text this morning, we discover these disciples of Jesus in a somewhat compromised position. They had been handpicked by the carpenter of Galilee to receive the gospel and to present the gospel to the world. And instead of going out there in the world and proclaiming the gospel, they are hiding themselves away. They're afraid that there's a cross waiting on them. They're afraid of death. They don't want to die. And so they're hiding away. They are filled with fear. Now, although this is the third Sunday of Easter, we're 3 weeks away, it was the first day for them. It's still Easter Day in our text. Okay? So the image of Friday is still burnt on their soul. That cross against the skyline is still firmly in their mind, and they're hidden away. They're only 3 days from the crucifixion. Now, I cannot imagine what might be going through their minds. Now, I've been on this planet 64 years. And I've lost a lot of people in my life, as you have. Those of you who are older have probably lost more than I have, but we all lose people. Al and I were talking about a loss just earlier. Childhood friends, grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, in-laws, outlaws, teachers, adult friends, daughters, sons, church members that we've lost. I have lost 2 brothers in the midst of all that as well. One was killed and one was murdered. And they were both younger than me. And we didn't have a brother relationship. I was more like their uncle because of the age difference between us. But I remember when the second brother was killed, and I had a little garden, as I usually did. At every parsonage, I'd have me a little garden. And I remember standing out there in that garden. And a voice whispered through me. It's the voice of the holy, because it's your voice, but it's too deep to be your voice. You know that voice. You've heard it before, I'm sure. And I heard that voice say, buddy, you've got a choice. Either you can celebrate what you had, or you can grieve over what you've lost. Celebrate what you had, or grieve over what you have lost. And by the grace of God, I chose the latter. I think those disciples were right there. I think they were right there. They are in that in-between state of emotion. The middle ground, you see, is fear. Their last nerve is frazzled. Their spiritual backs are breaking. They're in a deep emotional quagmire. Is he dead? Is he alive? Did somebody steal the body, or did God take him? Is he somewhere else, or is he in the world risen? Those women, when they went to the tomb, were they just hysterical, or were they telling the truth? Nothing made sense to these disciples. They lived up and personal with Jesus for nearly 3 years. They had seen the healings. They had heard the teachings. They had witnessed the relationship he had with the power structure in Jerusalem and the nobodies in Galilee. But now they're filled with anguish. Their souls are trembling with doubt and despair. They are in a deep, dark night of the soul. Ever been there? And in the midst of that deep, dark night of the soul, Jesus comes and stands in their midst. In the middle of that spiritual ache, and he whispers a word into their soul. Peace. Peace. Peace be upon you. And peace came to them. That made me think. You know, the world, what the world gives, the world can take away. And what the world gives, the world is going to take away. The world can give us momentary pleasure and teach us at the same time to despise life. It can provide a numbing of pain through unbridled drugs and activity and alcohol and travel and power and control, and then teach us to envy the dead. The world cannot give the peace our souls seek so desperately. You know, the world thinks it's at peace when guns are pointed at each other and nobody's pulling the trigger. And we have the illusion that we have peace today because we're not dropping nuclear bombs on one another. but we're still building more nuclear bombs. There is no peace. So when Christ came and stood in their midst, peace came to their souls. His presence brings, if you will, transformation. And can I say the big word? The big C word? Change. Christ brings change. It may not be the change, or it may not change our circumstance. It may not change our situation. What it does change is our attitude, our code, our conduct towards that situation, toward that circumstance. Do we celebrate or do we get angry? Now, through 5 years as a paramedic and 40 years as a pastor, I've seen that peace that comes into some of the most challenging conditions and settings. Sometimes it's on the highway in the middle of an accident and bodies are strewn. Sometimes it's in a hospital room amidst the blinking and beeping technology. Sometimes it's down there in the morgue where the blinking and beeping technology did not have any power or control. Sometimes it comes to parents who are wringing their hands, wondering if that child is going to come home tonight or not, if that child is alive or not. Sometimes it comes in lives where dreams have become unmentionable nightmares. And sometimes it comes in the pastor's study when a couple exposes the fact that they no longer have a loving relationship. We live in a violent world, folks. We live in a world that seems to have lost its way. We live in a world that no longer knows what's right and what's wrong. We don't know what's true, and we don't know what's false. We're unsure of the future, and we're uncertain of the past. We don't know how to predict the future, and we know how to undo the past. The world is restless and frightened. It's angry and it's cynical. And the solution to the problem, it seems to me, from what I see and read, the solution to our problems is to go out and kill somebody. Regardless if it's a child or an adult. The solution to our problems is to destroy something, to break something, to create division among people, to elevate suspicion. What more do we need than peace? But we don't need that peace the world gives, do we? We need the peace of Christ. Our hearts, our minds, our very souls are in need of this. We need the peace that comes from outside. We need that peace that comes from the Creator to the created order. That same kind of peace that we read about in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, where God takes chaos and makes order. We need chaos turned to order again in our world. In closing, I would like to share the life of someone I met years ago while in seminary. And I was kind of caught between that old Dewey Decimal System and the new computer system. And so my job was to move the books from Dewey Decimal to the computer. And I worked in the seminary library with Mr. Pitzer. And Mr. Pitzer was a beautiful soul. Loved him. He was 30 years my senior. And I remember listening to him like he was an old sage. And my mouth would just gape open, listen to his stories and the tales he would tell and the experiences. And he was so positive. He was so happy. I could drag my sorry self into that room, and in 10 minutes he had me feeling good. Just being with him. You ever been around somebody like that? Now the reverse is true too. You can be feeling great and go into a room and feel miserable, in somebody's presence as well. But not Mr. Pitzer. I don't care what kind of shape you were in mentally, you're going to feel better when you left him. And we would talk about everything. We didn't talk so much about politics and religion, although that was open, and we did some. We talked about literature, and we talked about art, current events, all those kinds of things. And you would think, or I thought then, that he didn't have a care in the world. How could you be so happy and have a care? And then I learned a little bit more about him personally. When he told me the story, I was absolutely stunned. For 30 years, his wife had suffered from polio. Just 10 years earlier, she had been diagnosed with cancer. For 30 years, he had risen at 4 a.m., did the laundry, the house cleaning, and cooked her breakfast and lunch. 2 days a week, when he had to work till 9 o'clock at night in the library, he actually had to cook 3 meals. He actually prepared her dinner as well. And then he would leave home at 7:30 to go to work. Now, you would think he would be a bitter man, wouldn't you? You would think he would be angry at God, or at least mad at the world for the demands placed on his shoulders and the limitations made on his life. Instead, Albert Pitzer was filled with hope. Albert was filled with pleasant camaraderie, gentle words. He was pleasant, he was jovial, and you just had a good spirit about him. And how, he told me that one night as well, how was he able to pull himself out of that, all that pain? He said it was simply the peace of Christ that gave him the will to do what he did and does. And he said also, I didn't get that from the world. I didn't get it from the world. I got it from the risen Son. All you can do, according to Albert, is accept it from the hand of God and say thank you. Thank you. The peace that God gives through Christ passes all understanding. And it's that peace that makes it possible to play life's violin, to go on playing when you only have one string and still make beautiful music with your life. It's that peace that comes when keeping the back from breaking when life throws another bale on your back when you think the last straw has already broken it. Instead, you're able to continue to walk in a straight line toward an eternal destination. Now I'm going to close with a simple little poem. G.A. Studdard Kennedy wrote this. Peace does not mean the end of striving. Joy does not mean the drying of all our tears. Peace is the power that comes to our souls arriving up to the light where God himself appears. Amen.
Let's stand together and sing. We'll sing verse 1, 3, and 5 of our closing hymn. Verse 1.